Mattiuzzi,
Mattiuzzi, Laís Machado are here with me right now. Let me introduce myself. Initially, this conversation will start with a text, a brief reflection about our contemporary situation. It is a reflection that I think is very linked to the conversation that we are going to have. And after this reflection, we will start the conversation with both of the artists. My name is Denise Ferreira da Silva. I am currently a professor and director of the Institute of Social Justice of the British Columbia University in Vancouver, Canada. I work and live in the lands of the indigenous nation, lands that have been appropriated by the Canadian state. And it is a pleasure to participate in this festival. It's an even greater pleasure to be in conversation with both of these beautiful artists. So moving on to the text called After It's All Said. What else there is to do, say, remember, tell, and write and create after everything's been done and said? How many more times should the critical and artistic work recite the episodes of colonial and racial violence? How many more times should be required recognition that an offense has occurred? In which other way can we articulate the cry for justice? How many more dead bodies we will have to accumulate until there is enough evidence? How many more Black people were killed by police in the United States and Brazil during the crisis of the new coronavirus? João Pedro, 14 years old, real police shot him in the back. And many others every day. In Brazil, the same state that enters the Black and indigenous territories to kill and facilitate the exploitation practice of natural resources, work and finance of global capitalism. The state that has constantly been destroying the few protections, human rights, and the few public policies, is now adding decisions and health policies that are guaranteeing even more deaths among indigenous, Black, and brown populations economically disadvantaged. Once again, the United States, Breonna Taylor was killed in her sleep. Not content with the humiliation, the police tortured George Floyd by suffocating, leading Minneapolis to flames. Meanwhile, with over 100,000 deaths due to the coronavirus in the United States, includes one in every 2,000 Black people. Once again. In Brazil, well, you already know. You can't even count it. What counts? What is counted? How many more times you have to ask the same question, to which impunity is the answer? The lives that do not count are these whose work and lands today constitute the blood and flesh of global capitalism. On the one hand, it seems that everything has already been said and there's nothing more to be done. And at the same time, it's as if we're still trying to find an explanation or produce a description of this historic moment in the global world. An explanation that finally understands how the mechanisms of power, symbolic, economic, and legal of capitalism, now in its neoliberal phase, with its emphasis on extraction and financial speculation, and its lack on interest in preserving the planet and in its human inhabitants. Exhausted in the face of this context, I know the inability of the discourse of the left wing and the reality of understanding, articulating a distinction and effective of the racial generation. Not only, though mainly, when he operates along with other social categories, the gender or sexuality. the physical and neurological diversity and the status of immigrants. Also, when he operates as a crucial element for the accumulation of capital and the perpetuation of the colonialism, in particular when he eases the structures of expropriation and exploration of work capacity and lands. On one side, as if we were stuck in time 40 years behind, the left-wing political speech regarding the historical materialism fell in at least two ways. At first, there is no effort to go beyond the liberal thesis on racial subgeneration, which captures in terms of the mechanisms of exclusion and discrimination, or the traditional form of the Marxist discourses of having a mechanism of division of the working class, which prevents its organization and facilitates the exploitation of the surplus value. In second place, one thing that shares with the critically in general is the inability of the historical materialism to leave the tracks of naturalization of cultural difference produced by anthropology. This sect is most evident in accusations of essentialism, generally presented as a political criticism of identity. Charges that still today are addressed to the argument about the political importance of the race and coloniality. So much colloquiality, while the theoretical arsenal includes tools that can be mobilized to produce analyses of the operations of the coloniality, that are still organized by the center figure of the modern thoughts, I mean the transparent subjects. The critical efforts, mainly in the post-structural fields, consistently reproduce both of them. With the historical materialism, the liberal version of the racial subjugation, and maintains itself in the anthropological parameters and its version of the other racial subjects. For these and other reasons, we don't have time to discuss, but even though are relevant to this conversation, I have dedicated the last few years to exploring and speculating about the possibility of a thought in which, instead of exploring, detaches the imagination of infrastructures of the modern thought, as in text and also in elaboration of poetic readings. As in its films, it's not about the effort to make artistic practice a substitute for this critical task. It's not about a movement or appropriation or incorporation or even expansion, not for several reasons. The main one being the fact that the field of the arts, especially the practices in the global market of the contemporary art, register the same characteristics pointed in my commentary about historical materialism and critically. What attracts and mobilizes me about the work of Black and Indigenous artists based in the North or South are their aesthetic practices and the thing that makes them possible and what they make possible. More precisely, the fact that it's impossible to learn and understand both the initial intention that leads to the realization of work, the thing that becomes eventually, and what happens with the work once it's available in the world. I mean, it's virtually that dimension of work that refuses and escapes. It doesn't matter what is updated. In terms of what the artist makes of the original idea, of what the material used and what the circumstances make possible or impossible, or how the audience respond to the work. In recent writings, I have tried to inhabit this virtually by mobilizing the radical potential, disturbing and potential of the Black female body, not only but mainly how this confronts and exposes the colonial violence. Among other gifts, this body offers a moment of existential relief in the face of exhaustion caused by the repetitive act of violence and by the limitations of discourses and practices of the left wing and the criticati. The existential relief materializes as an intellectual expansion and an emotional bath that I experience in face of Michele Machado's work and Laís Machado, with whom I have the pleasure to talk very soon. For me, it is an honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to them. I know they don't like the expression, but there is no better one in Portuguese to express what I want to communicate. And the fact that they are references in contemporary Brazilian art, I'm not going to preface the interview. The outline of the conversation is to satisfy my selfish desire to hear them talk about their work, their aesthetic practice, and comments on current themes in contemporary art and what is left to come. Enjoy it. Well, thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to start by introducing you two, and then we move on to the questions. MuSa Mattiuzzi is a performer, a film director, a writer, and body researcher. She has a degree in communication from the arts of the body with PUC São Paulo. Her works appropriate and subvert to the exotic place attributed to the body of the Black woman by the Imaginarium from the white perspective, and that transforms into a kind of aberration, an entity divided between the wonderful and the object. Between various artistic participations, in 2018, her most recent one in 2018, she participated in the 23rd Biennale, actually the 32nd Biennale of São Paulo, with the project about affinities of the Afro-affective. She now lives in Berlin. I am also pleased to introduce you Laís Machado Alandiró, a body artist, co-founder of the Aracá platform and creator of the Fórum Obimbem, Black Women, Latin America, and Contemporary Arts. I am repeating it, right? I'm repeating myself. Well, so thank you very much for accepting this conversation. And I would like to start with two comments, actually. I actually don't have questions, but I have a comment to which I would like both of you to respond to, or to distort, or to portray in any way you want. So, Laís, I will start by quoting something you said about your persona, the Dantesque obsessive. Unquote. Dantesque obsessive was an expression used to identify myself during a joke, where I realized that this term could be applied to many of my sisters. And that's why I have a serious tone. This persona inhabits me, and it's called Dantesque obsessive, as a monothematic, a very sensible one, very shocking, grotesque, arrogant, monstrous, and black. In this performance, you create a context in which you respond to the desires of the Dantesque obsessive. I think is a confrontation. And what I think is a characteristic of a radical colonial position. But my direct question is, how do you situate this character in the context of your work? So, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this event, the conversation with both of you. The Dantesque Obsessive is a work for which I have lots of affection, and it's very important for me due to the fact that it was my first authorial work where I started to actually try to own this discussion that I was taking to the scene. Also due to the fact that it somehow guided and reorganized everything I had been researching until then. So the poetics that I had been developing since Dantesque was born from what was taught, discussed in that context, in the action, in the performance events. I will briefly describe my work to continue talking about my poetics in a general way, but the task obsessive, I would create a context of a show which people were invited to give me alcoholic drink for 2 hours or more. And as I was getting drunk and drunk, I was talking about all of my personal obsessions, philosophical, political, personal, of relationships, etc. It was all improvised, but the songs really served as a script for the area that I wanted to talk about. And it's important to say that I chose the alcoholic drink due to a reference to a case that had happened back then of a woman who had been raped by 33 men at the time. And in that circumstance, the situation would be reversed because who had the power at that moment? The person who gave me the drink, to the point that I was completely drunk, or me who had the decision to drink and to have the microphone in my hand as I was doing it. So that points to a characteristic that is very important to me inside of my work. That is, I am not so interested in the inversion of power, but in the tension of these power relationships, of wearing out and taking it to the limit. So it is evident the complexity of that network. It doesn't always work, but the experiments and the motivation, the path is really in this direction. Another thing that I also think is important when talking about the task, but then talking about my work in a general way, is that I share the belief that what I call scenic presence is not something that I have as a performer or that any performer has, but is actually a consequence of the relationship. And then thinking about being an Afro-diasporic person in Brazil, I only exist in relation with myself in my own complexity. You relate to me in my contradiction. You relate to me in my fullness and what it would mean. And then the relationship and what the body is able to do, these are things that are absolutely motivating for me and to my poetic. And there I was also able to test if a person would present evidently a politicized person who was elaborate on the cultural, historical, social context that I am involved, but in there facing the alcohol and my filters that were getting more and more confusing, my contradictions were also very evident. Contradiction that which I am still confronting, which I'm still dialoguing with, which I am still discovering, and that would generate an atmosphere of content that was also part of that work. And what I think was also making a change in that situation is that there was an authorization for me from my own to not worry about the embarrassment caused, because there were already so many constraints that my body had, that in that moment it was in the world divided, and I was no longer responsible about how that would reach other people or would affect the whiteness or how it would affect the compliances of this violence. And this was not actually an inversion of the places of power, but actually a breach of the expectations about my body. And so, concluding, for not to take very long and for us to be able to talk more about it, the task is difficult to identify where it was, if it was a performance or a theater. And it shares also with my belief that the forms that is structured, the art languages, they were structured to handle a few discourses. So from the moment that another narrative puts itself in that place, these structures need to be reorganized because they do not fit. They do not fit what that narrative needs to express itself. And then thinking about this body that is not even an African body, but also it's not recognized in its dignity, for example, in Brazil, where I'm situated, that what possibility there is for me but to create a performatic event where it's possible to experience other forms of power. So I think this is my first participation. Okay, so thank you very much. I'd like to talk to you in another moment about your function in the relationship powers. I think is a very powerful preposition. So, MuSa, So, in your text, breviary of a performance action, you say, quote, "In the city, I started walking with a wig and sunglasses. This is one of my programs. The performance as a possibility of experiencing senses generate chaos and generate instability in several degrees. I believed that I could provoke an intervention in that space, but I did not know that my provocation would be received with such intensity. In that context, I start to build the action." Unquote. Your performance action brings the body to the center of the creative movements. In your turn, as I see it, the body in a way that refuses to read appropriations. Could you please comment on this action and how it presents itself in the context of your work? Yes, of course. It's very interesting because this text, it appeared after I started to experiment performances in Bahia, in Cachoeira. And so it was like with my intuition, I started to follow the steps of a game that I was never able to play. When I say the game, I say the University of Arts. I studied arts. And so it was a game in which I was always able to participate, but just watching. So I'd always feel insecure to do it, to do the art game, because I never had the ball in my hands. So I'd always see the ball and I would watch with lots of attention all of the steps. The ball that I call is my colleagues of my class doing the scenes and studying and having all of the material, anyway, having all of the conditions to do the creation. And for me, it was very strong to read, to know about all of this, because with your question, I am able to elaborate this trauma, because what I lived was a trauma. So it's very interesting because I was actually waiting for this question, because this is about how I would move inside of the art, what would interest me. And so in that place, it's very nice because I was able to transport to that place. And so I could remember what interested me. And the creation, the art interested me, study text and to produce creatively. And that was my interest. And so I remember that in my creation classes, I'd also participate and create anyway, but I was never able to be the main voice of that context. So I didn't actually have a real dialogue. But anyway, fortunately, I had a colleague in my class that she's called Sarayauto Panambi. And Sarayauto, different from me, she had a artistic life because her mother was an artistic artist. So she was not afraid to create because she learns at home. And in the university, she actually knew what she was doing. She was just continuing doing what she was already doing. So that presence really was my foundation to be able to be there in that space, because I couldn't have a dialogue. I was what I am. And so to be what I am is to receive all of the violences of this process that are involved inside of the Brazilian system. And so I participated of everything I could participate. I would propose what I could do. And even though I didn't have a repertoire, that was the affirmation of my teachers and of my colleagues. Even present, I would never miss any class. But I wasn't enough. My presence there wasn't enough for me to be there. I wasn't worthy in the minds of these people to be there, but not to Sarayauto. For her, I was very worthy of being there. And despite of all of this insecurity, because of that space, my intuition really told me, you can do it. Just relax, that you can do it. And so when I arrived to Salvador, when I arrived to Salvador, it was my possibility to do what I had done in the university, that was to learn to use the tools of the plantation house. And so when I went to live in Salvador, I went to Cachoeira and I did my first artistic process. That was a program in which I would fantasize myself with a pink wig, Leonard Prince blouse. It was not carnival, it was just a normal day. And I would walk in the city of Cachoeira. I never actually lived there, so I would walk there, and for 7 days I did that in the same time, crossing the same places. And in the 7th day, I was finally accepted by the city as a persona doing art. But in the beginning, it was like, do you think that person has a mental issue? Do you think she's a homeless or she needs something? Anyway, I was never in the position of an artist. I had to go through the 7 days to be finally able to affirm my presence, my artistic presence, my Black presence in that contest. And that was an exercise, an intense exercise that I didn't know if it was going to work, as Laís talked about the failure of promoting an artistic event. And I didn't know if it was going to work, but I did it anyway. And I put my history there, all of my artistic knowledge with the tools that I have from the plantation master house to perform this process. And so it was an experiment for me of my knowledge of the tools of the plantation house. And so the tools of creation of the big house, they did not serve me. And so when I understood that the tools of the plantation house were restricted for me, it was as if my world were falling down. But then I understood that I couldn't go back. There was not a place to go back to. And so I understood that I had to move forward and that I could actually use these tools, but in a species of a refusal. And that was when I started to do a process that would go through my body, so create a plan of escape routes and not a performance plan. That was where I understood in this process I was doing and reflecting about this action. Because it was like things really reached me. I think that's it. The microphone. Microphone is off. Listening to you and listening to the connection to what you've said before, I was thinking about it's not only about creating, about the work, but it's also about creating the conditions of creation to create the work in a context where the affection is not taken into consideration. And so it really is about an accessibility, about assessing what the tools of the plantation house does. So talking about the world of the contemporary arts, there are two themes, the invisibility and visibility and opacity, that are circling at this moment about contemporary art, and discourses that also talks about Afro women and trans and colonized world. And these themes really do a reference to the construction of the academic, artistic work, also political work, conditions that are marked by the symbolic violence, the legal violence, the police violence. And so I would like to listen a little bit about you, listen to your reflection on these themes. Michele, do you want to begin? Yes, of course. So, talking about the last question, about the last conversation, I was very obsessive about the the experience because I didn't have a trajectory, something that I would listen and that I still listen. So I had just been gone, I had just been in Rio de Janeiro, and I had done a work with Saraiото, which was my first exercise. And I was in a territory, I was in a black territory. I had never been to Rio de Janeiro. It was my first time. So it was like my world would just fall down. So I went there and I did this first experiment, and I felt that I was really willing to take risks, to experience more the tools of the plantation house, but then in another territory, because in the university I didn't have the opportunity to do that. And so I decided to use these tools with my troubles in Salvador. And so going through all of that, I didn't have time to create my art. So in Salvador, in all of this process of experimenting in a black territory, I began to understand how to do all of the layers and complexities, and also, how can I say that? And also it was a way to look at my background process and to be able to experiment it without any kind of rule. So my choice was to move to Salvador, to get to this territory that was not known for me, but very acknowledged to my body. So it was very strong for me. It was like another experience that really located in my own body. Because in that moment, when I arrived in Salvador, it was my first experience in a city with a majority of people that was black. Of course, in Sao Paulo there are many black people, but with the possibility to be in different kinds of context, you can't be in a city and look at the black people in the same way. So for me, it was like, wow, I reached a place, so I need to point my choices to a possible path in this territory. So my arrival in the city was with lots of enthusiasm to create, and always escaping from the readings and tools of the plantation house. And how does that work? Not accepting the critics, to listen to it and talk about it, but do not accept it. And no, because my path, I've done my path already. You didn't listen to me when I was inside of your space, so now it's not your turn anymore. So it was a lot like that. And in the process of this work, learning the tools, I was able to understand how to deceive it, how to deceive the system, and how to act inside of it. And it was also about putting myself out there in the things that happened to me, the racism things, chauvinism actions. And so I began to understand that at every moment that I would start a work in which I would put my body in this radical perspective, I would actually repeat and actionate again my colonial memory. And in that sense that I decided to act, negotiating with the audience about these passages and about all of these paths. And it was also a tool that I was able to do to read the systemic violence in all of its gestures of refusal that I would do in an artistic process, that I would put in the center the racial issue. So talking to you right now and understanding my artistic process, I am able to look at the works I've done as a trilogy that I'm calling right now The Memories of the Plantations. And this trilogy, it was my possibility to walk invisibly, but at the same time visibly, because it was my only possibility to walk in the art with my colonial memories. So I tried to work this this issue using the tools of the plantation house. And then when I understood that every time I would trigger this process, I would actually be remembering a colonial trauma, and this trauma, it's never going to end. It's a trauma of the territory. And so I understood that this is my trauma, but it cannot be part of my current movement, because if I put this trauma as part of my movement, I am declaring my death. And so I was basically going through all of this and trying to understand, using the tools of the plantation house, but without the right tools to be able to elaborate all of this process. So it's almost 12 years doing all of it without being able to elaborate, just doing and doing and doing and doing it. But only now I am elaborating it and I'm able to see it as if it was a map. All of this procedure of escaping that is built at each escape route, at each step and starting points. And that's it. So, Laís, can you talk a little bit now? Do you want to comment something before I start talking? No, you can proceed. So, talking about everything that you're bringing right now, I think it starts about the moment where you decide to become an artist, because it's a huge risk for you to throw yourself in an area, like in Brazil, for example, the territory that I am in a territory that do not have a cultural policy, interesting cultural policy. So you really throw yourself at a huge risk and you don't know if you're going to handle it. And talking about specifically economical risk, the difficulty of establishing a career that is not in the academic field, for example. And besides creating the spaces to be able to create these things, there's also another place that is complicated, which is where are you able to publish all of these things? Because remembering what I said in the first time, when you're experimenting another language, and if it's already difficult to define what you've said, which place is going to accept your work, which expectation there is about your work, when you are a Black woman in the northeast of Brazil, in these spaces that are more hybrid, and they experiment, they expect something from you. And so another thing that I also think is the act itself experimenting. I always say that the only certain thing about the risk is that it's going to go wrong. It might go right, but the expectation that you have at first is that you're going to make mistakes. But for us, it's not allowed to make mistakes. And so it's very difficult to take these risks of experimentation and investigation that can really bring you some important experiences. And another important thing is that you never have enough trajectory. So every time you're doing another job, it really seems like you're starting your career that day, and as if that person is giving you another chance. And that, of course, that reflects on the economical issue, because what I think is most painful, difficult to deal with, and we talk a lot about it personally, is that this relationship with the economical violence for an artist is very heavy, because besides establishing a career and establish network that is important to continuing the work, you also need to deal with how do you create if the money or the absence of it is really important. The absence of work is imminent, and then we're talking about a place to live, transportation, food, clothing. So how do you deal all of that in your work? And that really exhausts you. That's exhausting. And many times they ask me a kind of distancing or tranquility in what I create, but that cannot happen because I am exhausted. It needs to come out of me, otherwise I'm going to die. And then I bring a quick example of this situation, that these violences, they're very complex, but not always visible. So for example, bringing the case of the own festival that we're talking about, not directly to the festival, because I think it's a very complex network for us to discuss. I was invited to do a video, something that could be online on the chronogram. So I followed my relationship to my ancestors. I followed this construction and deconstruct of the feminism. And I did my study on the feminism so that I could present it, but it can be only presented one time at one day, because there is a part of the take. I understand all of the complexity around it, and I understand it's more complex than that, but it's actually considered pornographic. And then I asked myself, what is considered pornographic? The economic exploitation of my body, because this is natural, this is not considered pornographic. But at the same time, again, why am I repeating so much that it's not to do with the festival, the organization? Because not that I'm defending the festival organization, but the networks are so complex in the internet in the middle of a pandemic, and this is the only place that we can put our work, but these laws, these rules are still on in here. So how do you deal with these violence, especially the ones that are not visible, the ones that exhaust you and compromise you, that interfere in what we are producing, you know? Well, finish. Well, thank you very much, Dee. I was thinking about this relationship between the precariousness and representativeness, because relating to everything that you've said, the representativeness is like the only place that is authorized, that is possible to present your work. And so it's absolutely controlled, which is not necessarily a violence that takes out your blood, but it really takes out your creativity. It really takes your air away. So we have only 5 minutes left. And so I think we have time for the comments that I would like to listen from you, that are also have to do to all of this. As you know, in my critical reflections, I call the attention to the end of the word as we know it. And for me, the end of the word is not actually an event, it's not a proposition of a linear movement. The end of the word, as we know, is to exist in the world as a different way, right here, right now, and always. So I'd really like to listen a little bit about you. Maybe, Laís, you can start? So, wow. This work that I just told about is part of the trilogy, Machines of the End of the World, because it's especially bringing the world not as a future, but as the end of these relationships of power in which we are at. And this is absolutely desirable. It really mobilizes me, the things that I'm building. And that's why it's grotesque, that's why it's absurd and surreal. But this is always me. This is always a part of me. This desire is part of me. For example, this crisis that we have right now, there is a apocalyptical circumstance, but the Black people live in the circumstance. So this is not something new for me, because the absence of money exists, the risk of violence and death exists, the risk of the end exists. So this apocalyptical atmosphere, it's not new for us. We dance around it for like forever, because it's the only possibility that we have. And so I produce it, and I actually came to bring the chaos. I came to bring the end of the world, because we have this conspiracy, right? Yes, exactly. We came to dance with the dead. We are here to bring out the dead as a recovery of all of these forces that were brutally murdered. So in our position, that is the artistic position, that is a position denied, especially in our country, to people like us, to Black people. So when we are actually able to structure yourselves and do a trilogy, for example, this is actually evoking the end of the world, is bringing the forces, all of the radical forces of what is this violence. For a long time now, I was considered a person that wouldn't listen. And this is very interesting because this construction of this narrative about me, it's about my work because the people don't actually know me. And it's very interesting how my poetic is very radical. People forget that I am actually a person. And so it's very crazy because they're not even able to read the poetics. They're not able to see the tools that I'm using. And so you see that either we finish this right now, either it won't be possible. And after I understood that I was elaborating a collective trauma that are the memories of the plantation, right now I really gave up this process. I'm not going to work anymore with the plantation memories. But that doesn't mean that I don't have attention to everything that's going on. So knowing that right now I'm abandoning the tools of the plantation house, so knowing that I'm abandoning these discussions of representativeness, when I actually start to do that, I really detach from the prison that was built inside of the colonial farm that is Brazil. And so now I am forging, I'm deceiving with iron and fire new narratives, and they're not plantation memories anymore, they're actually seeds for the future. So I'm really planting new seeds for the future. And this is my path. And now, quoting you, Denise, the intuition really frees the imagination. Yes, and that's it. This world is not good for me. This world let us know every day that I don't fit in it. So I am sorry, but it has to fall down. Well, we close with your words. So thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Thank you much. See you in the end of the world. Good night.